What's up everybody, welcome back. So in this video I'm gonna show you how to set up an idle animation with curves, and I'm gonna show you how you can play it in your character as an idle animation and how it blends in perfectly with the blend spaces that we created in the previous video, which are also made with curves. So the animation itself is really ugly, but that's not the point of the video. So it's just to show you how you can do it. So I've used these curves to create the idle animation, and I'm going to show you how you can play it on your character as well. So let's get started right away. So let's start by making the curves that we need for our idle animation. I'm going to use the CurvePlayer for it. It's a tool that I created. You don't need to have to use it, but if you want to get your hands on this tool, you need to join the gamedev raw Discord, and you can get it there for free. So let's start by creating our curves. So I'm going to right click, go to miscellaneous and create a curve, and that's going to be a vector curve. Now let's call this idle translation pistol. And I also need a rotation curve, so I'm going to copy this and call this my idle rotation pistol. And now I need to add these to my CurvePlayer. So let's go to the CurvePlayer and open the character. Select the CurvePlayer on the left side, and then I'm going to add one translation and one rotation curve. And I'm going to select the walking one, idle ones. So idle translation and idle rotation. And now we should be good to go. So let's just launch the project. And I'm going to launch it in the viewport so I can eject my pawn if I would like to. So there we go. So let's load our previous settings first. So we have the blend spaces in here if we want to. And now I'm going to start with the idle animation. So first I'm going to set up the track. And I'm just going to add the curves to these tracks. So the idle translation and the idle rotation curve. Now you see there's nothing in these curves yet, so we need to edit them, but first I'm going to save it so I don't need to set this up every time, and it will load the curves automatically. So that's done. Now let's get the curves in here. So I'm just going to minimize my viewport and open up both of the curves, so the idle rotation and the idle translation one. And now get the viewport back up here as well. So all we need to do in here is make the translation and the rotation for the aim socket bone. Well, it's more the IK hand gun bone, but the effect is the same. So we're just going to add translation and rotation in these graphs to make our animation. So first let's start by adding some keyframes at 0. And this is my translation one, so I probably want to move the gun from left to right a little bit, so I need the Y. So I do have the correct graph, that's nice. Now let's make this something about 12 seconds long. So I'm gonna put another keyframe at 12 seconds and make sure that it's at 0 as well. Now let's just create a few extra points in this curve so we have something to edit. And now I can put this first one back at 0 as well, so we can easily select our curves. So let's just move it around a little bit. I'm not going to care too much about how this actually looks. That's not really the point of this video. So let's just make something like this. So we have a really sharp curve right now, and we can adjust all of these settings as well. So if I select all of the keyframes that I added, and I could select something like cubic interpolation or flat tangents and stuff like that. So now you get a nice smooth curve, and that will smooth out the movement as well. So let's save this curve and let's see how this looks. So if I go into my CurvePlayer, right now we edited the length of the curve, but it's not updating. So we have the little reload button over here, and if I click it, then the correct curve length will be loaded as well. So I'm going to set the length of this curve to the first track, so I can use this track to play this animation because this is track 1. And now I can simply play it. So let's set it to looping for track 1 and let's play it, and something should happen. So it's moving forward and backward. Obviously I need to use x-axis, so that's my mistake. But you see a little bit of movement here, so it's actually working. So let's get back into our curves and let's add some movement to the x-axis as well. So we have the Z, we don't need that one, so I'm gonna go over to the x-axis and just add a few keyframes. Get rid of this one. There we go. So it's a middle mouse button to add keyframes quickly. If you just click on the graph with your middle mouse button, it will add a keyframe. So again, I'm not going to worry too much about how this looks. I'm just going to make sure something is happening. So 0, 0 for the beginning and the last keyframe, and then just move some stuff around over here. So this is not going to be pretty, but whatever. So set this to cubic interpolation to smooth things out a little bit. And let's see how this looks. So as you can see, it's swaying from left to right a little bit. So we actually have some kind of animation going on here. Now let's quickly do something in our rotation curve as well, and I'm just gonna move on to implementing this in the character then. So let's just add a few keyframes, and I'm gonna put this one at 12 seconds and fit the curve to the screen. So what axis do we have here? It's the Y. Well, it doesn't really matter, so just I'm gonna add a few frames over here. So that's the 0. I want to keep this one at 0. And then I want to move these around a little bit. So something about 5 maybe. What's happening over here? There we go. And I'll set this to -5. And I'm going to select all of the keys and then go for the cubic interpolation again. So we have some rotation going on here as well. So it's a bit much actually, but well, like I said before, I'm not really gonna matter too much about how this looks. It's just the point of creating something, and I'm gonna show you how you can add this to your character. So we have some kind of animation going on, and let's jump into our character to make this our idle animation. So I'm back in my game project where we created the blend space in the previous video, and I have the idle curves in here, so I copied them into my game project, and I'm going to show you how I can set them up as my idle animation. So first, let's add some stuff to our character and open the first person character in here. We're going to use a timeline to play our curve animation, so right click and we're going to add a timeline. So let's call this the animation idle timeline. If you double click this, it opens up and you can add curves in here. So on the top left you can add a float, vector and event tracks, and also color tracks, by the way. So we're going to add 2 vector tracks. The first one is going to be our idle translation, and add another one, and that's our idle rotation. And now we can simply assign the curves to the curves in this timeline. So if you click the little drop down over here, you can set the idle translation pistol and the idle rotation pistol. So there we have our curves. Now let's set this to autoplay and to loop over here at the top. And then we can compile and save it, and let's close it over here so we go back to the event graph. Now let's create a custom event for this and call this a play animation idle track, and hook this up to the play button over here. Now you'll see these outputs are from the graphs that we added, so we can store these in variables. So simply right click, promote to variable, and that's my animation idle translation. And then I'm gonna also create the animation idle rotation. And that's a rotator, obviously. So we're gonna set this as well. But first we're gonna split the struct pin and also split the vector over here, so we can hook them up. And then we simply hook this up to the update pin over here and make sure we connect this. So we have the variable set in our character, and that's pretty much all we need to do in here. So let's move on to the animation blueprint. So let's open up our animation blueprint and let's start in the animation graph. So we're gonna add a transform modify bow node again, so make a little bit of room in here, and I'm gonna add it before our blend spaces. So simply copy and paste one of the transform modify bow nodes, but if you copy and paste it, make sure that you have it set to add to existing for component space, and that's for both translation and rotation. So double check your settings and make sure it modifies the correct bone, obviously, but you shouldn't have to change it if you copy and paste it. So connect it up, and now we need to promote the translation and rotation to a variable. So that's my animation idle translation and the animation idle rotation. So make sure you hook them up to the transform modify bow node. And then we need to create a function to set these variables. So let's create a new function. And let's call this something like update animation idle track. So in here we are simply going to do pretty much the same as we did with the blend spaces. So let's get our character in here and let's get the variables that we need. So get the animation idle translation. And first we're going to store this in a local variable. So promote to local variable, and that's my target translation. Then we're going to interpolate this to our current translation, or actually we're going to interpolate our current translation to this new translation. So interp to, and that's going to be a vector interp to. So from our current animation idle translation to our target translation, and we need to get the world delta seconds and set an interp speed. So let's start with something like 3 or 4. It shouldn't be have to be too high, but you can mess around with it. And then we're gonna store this in the animation idle translation. And let's do the same thing for our rotator. So let's get the rotator from the character, get anim idle rotation, and promote it to a local variable, target rotation. Now let's interpolate our rotator, so r_interp to from the current rotation, so that's the animation idle rotation, to our target rotation, and store it in the animation idle rotation again. Get the world delta seconds and set the speed, and we should be good to go. So get a return node and go back into the event graph and make sure that we plug this into the event update animation. So drag in the new function and plug it in over here. And now I think we should have the idle animation playing, so let's give it a shot. And there we go. So as you can see, it combines with our blend spaces, so those are still working as well. And we have a very ugly idle animation playing, but that's not really the point. You can see that it's working. So I'm noticing that it's not actually looping as it should probably. So I think the timeline is set to 5 seconds. So that could be an issue that we need to tackle. So by default this is set to 5 seconds and we need to make sure that it updates to the length of our animation. So we can set it manually over here, but if you want to make these curves variables, if you have different characters and things like that, you can do it in a different way as well. So if we go to the event graph and over here, let's do it in the event begin play probably. Yeah, let's get event begin play. So we're going to get the component for our timeline, drag it in here, and then we're going to set timeline length mode, I think. Yeah, and then we can set it to last keyframe. So now it will automatically adjust the length to the last keyframe. And because we set it to autoplay in here, it actually plays by itself. So we could disable this and then just call the event in begin play. So later on this will be more useful if we start using other tracks as well. So right now it doesn't really matter, but let's set it up like this. So now event play will trigger the idle animation and it should loop at 12 seconds now. So let's have a look. So it's still ugly AF, but at least it's looping correctly. So that works. So that's how we can set up an idle animation with curves, and the blend spaces are still working as I mentioned before. So we have both of them combined. So I think that's everything that I got for you today. Thanks for watching everybody. Talk to you later. Bye bye.